Thank you, everybody, and apologize for the little problem at the beginning. So my talk today is about the question of involving stakeholders in the transportation planning decision making. And in this context, appraisal is just a tool to an end. The end is a good transportation planning exercise in which decisions related to transportation systems are taken in a reasonable and effective way. 5 parts of this presentation. First, a few words about what transportation planning is. We all are, I think, familiar with the concept of transportation planning. Some of us are practitioners as well, but still it's not trivial to put transportation planning in the correct light. And after that, the role of assessment, general assessment, not just cost-benefit analysis, all kinds of assessment in the transportation planning. Then I propose a model of cognitive and participative decision-making process that I have been working on. And there is a paper which is being published on that, together with my colleague Armando Carteni, which is also in the audience today, and will be able to answer all the difficult questions I will not be able to. And then I will shortly underline an application of this method to the regional plan of Veneto region in Italy, and mostly the lessons we learned from this experience, and finally some conclusions and recommendations for future research and regulation. I chose to call this first part to risks and failures, because we have seen in these days, as well as in our previous history, that transportation planning is a very risky business. I propose this definition of transportation planning. There are many possible alternative ones, of course, but I propose to define transportation planning as the decision-making process on public actions, including regulations and financing, including related to transportation infrastructures and services, in order to reach societal objectives. To see what we would expect from transportation planning, this is a short list of the desirable properties of this exercise. And these range from, of course, the need to address and the needs and problems which are widely recognized as such. Decision should solve these problems or address those needs as much as possible, and making a reasonable use of limited resources, starting from money, of course. Decisions should have a large consensus among decision makers and stakeholders. And finally, those decisions should be based on information as accurate as possible about their consequences, and those of possible alternative courses of action should be aware. So these are the definition and the requirements, or some of the requirements of the good transportation planning. They are very clear in my mind and simple. The problem is that the transportation planning exercise is not. As a matter of fact, in the literature and in the practice, we know that transportation planning as planning most of other socio-technical systems in our complex societies is more a nightmare than a technical exercise. Transportation planning, typically there are several decision makers, several stakeholders with different and contrasting values, objectives, interests. Some of the stakeholders, so not the official decision maker, have a veto or quasi-veto rights. This has been recognized in the social and political science literature since the early 90s. And Rittel and Weber defined this type of problems, so the kind of problems that planners deal with, as weak in the sense that they are perverse in a way, because problems are, they define weak as problems essentially unique. So there is no repetition of the problem. Every planning exercise is different from the other one. The problem can be considered a symptom of another problem, as no enumerable set of solutions, not well described set of permissible operations, and so on and so forth. So the problem of transportation planning is very complex. And because of that, there are a number of failures, the number of problems that are not solved efficiently. To make things a little bit worse, if possible, is that very often transportation planning is not a single level planning, but there are several levels of planning. Here, I just described the typical structure of a country like Italy, where you have local planning, say cities, having their own plans, producing their own projects according to local objectives and a decision-making process, local decision-making process. By the end of this, they decide what to do, and some of these projects are proposed to an upper level of decision-making, the country level. We have to allocate resources for financing these, say, metro projects, comparing different proposals from different cities. So the decision-making process at level one follow different objectives, different decision makers, different stakeholders, and the connection between the two is this double added arrow here, representing the way in which the central decision-making level may transmits to the local planning, which are their objectives, their criteria for evaluation of alternative projects. So let's stay with one level of transportation planning. Two is too complicated for discuss fully. So assuming the following, that there is just one level of transportation planning, but we have to keep in mind that in reality this is not the case. Often is not the case. So we have seen in these 3 days a number of planning failures. These are related to almost everything possible. Underestimation of cost and times, or overestimation of cost and times, errors in demand and revenue forecasts, miscalculation of direct effects and environmental safety, yesterday we saw, and other external impacts, and the inability, and this is the point I want to focus a little bit more on, the inability to carry through the planned actions due to lack of consensus or new governance cycles. There are two different causes of failure. Very quickly, through some very well-known example of demand forecasts error, or channel tunnel. We alluded to that yesterday. And let me go a little bit more in detail about the problem that the NIMBY syndrome or other even worse pandemic syndromes are affecting decisions around the world. Here is the well-known case of the Alp tunnel, the rail link between Turin and Lyon. And we perhaps have read on the paper the very strong opposition of the local communities, with some clashes between the policy and the participants to opposing rail and so on. So that, but this is not the only case. This is not the only case. These oppositions are not only related to new infrastructures, also for control measures, that are several road pricing schemes, for instance, which have been proposed in the world, have been cancelled altogether because of the opposition of residents. And this is the NIMBY, or the opposition of stakeholders of some groups of them to some decisions. But there are also another syndrome which is very common, at least in Italy, I'm sure everywhere else. This is what I call the Penelope Syndrome. Penelope was the Ulysses' wife, who during the day waved their cloth and during the night unwaved it, because she didn't want to marry someone she didn't want. So this is the cycle that we observe when there are subsequent political or governance cycles in companies, but mostly in administration, public administrations, when a new administrations just go back with respect to the decisions made by the previous one. Here is a well-known case of related to Detroit bus or light rail line, which was financed first and so on and so forth. But I could add a very large book of examples from Italian cities where the new mayor just went back with respect to decisions, even with funds already available to implement it. But this decision was taken by the previous administration. So to sum it up, the failures of transportation planning are connected to uncertainties in different things. We have uncertainties related to demand, and some of these uncertainties, as was said yesterday, are inherent. They cannot be solved by a better modeling or more accurate modeling effort. Travel behavior, user travel behavior, general economy parameters, the effects of the COVID pandemics, name it. All these things make uncertain the demand. We have uncertainty related to supply. These uncertainties are related to costs, implementation time, but we have also something very strongly coming on the fore screen, which is related to new disruptive technological changes, which are underway. Think, just to make an example, to connected autonomous vehicles. They are there. We don't know how long it will take for them to be widely used in the market, how they will affect the capacity of existing infrastructures. So we have some unknown related to some uncertainties related to supply, which are beyond our possibility to predict them with a limited amount of error. And then we have what I call context uncertainty. These uncertainties are related to the political cycle, as I said before, to the interest of stakeholders. Some of these interests are not disclosed or cannot be disclosed. And there are also the uncertainty related to the interactions with different decision makers, with different planning levels, as I shown before. So all these uncertainties are there, and they can have different level of uncertainties. In the literature, the convention is to have 4 levels of uncertainty. Of course, there is complete determinism, which is never the case. So we have a level 1 in which there is a clear enough future with some variations, which was the situation a few decades ago. Then we have a level 2 uncertainty where there are alternative futures, but we can sort of put probabilities to each of them, to each of the possible uncertain scenarios. Then we have level 3 with a few possible futures, but without a possibility of putting probabilities or Bayesian expectation about these future scenarios. And then we have level 4 uncertainty, which is called deep uncertainty in the literature. And this deep uncertainty can be level 4A, in which there are many possible futures without probabilities, of course, and level B, which totally ignorance, which is the case in which you cannot do anything. So, but level 1, level 4A obviously are all in possible for our decision-making process, and they should be recognized and dealt with in the way the process is managed, in the way projects are assessed. And we are to the problem of assessment. Which is the role of assessment in transportation planning, given all these complexities, these uncertainty types and uncertainty levels? Assessment in planning and design. I underscore this design here because assessment, I think, could and should be used not just for judging the merits of alternative projects, but also to build those projects. So technically, this is the conventional definition of assessment, is a technical activity aimed to compare or define and compare alternative options on the basis of the related impacts. And assessment techniques, this is my point, to be effective should be consistent with the overall decision-making approach followed. Just to make things clearer, cost-benefit analysis is consistent with a strongly rational approach to decision-making and low levels of uncertainty, up to level 2, in which we can compute the expected value of cost-benefit ratios. Okay, in the sense that we have a number of possible future scenarios, we can weigh those possible future scenarios and compare the expected value of some indicator, like the CBA indicators, and choose the solution which is the best with respect to the these expected indicators, cost-benefit indicator. If we use cost-benefit indicators in a decision-making context which is different from the strongly rational approach, we are using the wrong tool, in the sense that in that context, cost-benefit ratios cannot be the only parameter to rely on, simply because one project could even have a better cost-benefit ratio, but being strongly opposed by interested and powerful stakeholders. So the possibility of implementing it would be very low with respect to another project, which is perhaps less effective from a purely economic point of view, but has a much higher probability of being implemented. So if we recognize that the decision-making process we are involved in, the assessment tool should be consistent with that. And obviously, there are in the literature several decision-making models. They are theoretical models. In practice, not individual planning exercise do not conform to any of these models, but from the theoretical point of view, there are a number of models which have been proposed. Some are rational, in which assessment may play a role, and rational models are the strongly rational, the one I showed you before, satisfying or bounded rational models or cognitive models, while irrational models are also being proposed, as the garbage-can model, in which decisions came sort of randomly out of the combination of problems and solution, given that decision opportunity. Given another decision opportunity, the pairing of problem and solution could be different. And again, having some year of experience in public decision-making about transportation infrastructure in my country, and sure not only in Italy, there are a number of occasions in which you may recognize this type of decision-making approach. Shopping lists of projects according to other parameters, political power, influence, whatever, which come out without any form of rational or so-called rational approach. So let's me, in this context, say a few more words about this model of cognitive and participative decision-making process that we proposed recently in a paper which is going to be published and elaborate on a previous paper we had in 2015. So the main characteristics of this model of decision-making is that of being cognitive. Cognitive means, first of all, is not a one-shot decision-making exercise, is a process explicitly recognized as such. So there is a sequence of successive decision-making stages in which actors could even change their values, their objectives. So this takes into account the possibility of changing directions, changing values in a society, like with respect to the climate change, for instance, or to learn from previous, this is the important part, to learn from previous stages. How did they perform? So ex post evaluation is a part of the process. It's not something made out of it, because learning from what has been decided so far helps to decide better in the future, and the monitoring of the system. At each stage, decisions are made, and they are related to both long-term and short-term projects. The long-term, of course, are non-reversible, while short-term are more easily, even not zero-cost reversible projects. Decisions include both the need to do something, so decisions which are mature enough to be implemented, but also decisions related to what we would study better, we should design better in order to make more informed decisions in later stages of the project. So projects to be implemented and feasibility projects to be carried out in order to decide about them in future stages. And these are related to both long-term and short-term solutions, short-term options. Still, further, the model distinguishes between the technical assessment, process management, and public engagement activities. So there are three streams of activities strongly interconnected among them, and stakeholders, of course, should play a very important role from the beginning of the process, starting with the rules of the games. So they are not just asked at the end, which is the preferred solution, or exposed to the end, which are the preferred solution, but they are involved in different ways through the whole decision-making process, to the whole planning process. And this is the scheme of this model. These are the three streams I referred to before. This is the decision-making stream. There are several activities. I will just quote the one related to the visions, objectives, constraints, the assessment of criticality, the critical points of the present situation. Many plans, many projects derive from the need to solve some problems, which has to be perceived as such. So it's important that it's perceived as a problem, not only by the administration managing the planning process, but also by relevant stakeholders. And there are several decision sets, including long and short-term decisions. I am very strongly convinced that infrastructures alone, especially infrastructures which are less self-contained, like rail infrastructure we were discussing yesterday, need to be effective a set of accompanying measures which are very much part of the same decision. And then there is an explicit recognition of uncertainty. Which are the uncertainty levels that we have for the problem at hand? And according to that, different evaluation techniques should be used to compare, to assess the impacts of the proposed actions. Here is the technical evaluation assessment phase, obviously using the result of all the technical activities which are used to analyze the current situation, to project future scenarios, or the inability to assign weights and probabilities to possible scenarios, and of course put together sets of decisions, both short and long-term decisions, which are technically consistent. So based on all these technical elements, the evaluation is made according also to the reactions of stakeholders, which are informed and participate to the different stages of the decision-making process. And the satisfying solution, this bounded rationality, is reached when, I mean, this cannot be related to some quantitative element. This is part of the art of planning. I define that this way, in which some solutions have a reasonable consensus and is reasonably using resources and is functioning in a technical acceptable way. When these decisions are made, we decide at the end, as I said, something that should be implemented after this stage of the process, both long and short-term projects, but we also have long-term and short-term projects to be further studied through feasibility studies. I will come to that later. Feasibility studies are the way in which each state leaves something for the next decision-making stages. So at the next stage, these options will not just be options, but will have alternative projects that could be included with a sufficient confidence on related costs, implementation times, consensus levels for decisions to be put at the implementation phase. This is implementation. From the implementation, there are monitoring. Monitoring, in my interpretation, is very similar to what we discussed about ex post analysis, to see how things are working in the real world when they are implemented, how different they are from what we expected. We learn from that, and this also stakeholders learn from that, and this feedback here just accounts for this cognitive phase, I mean, structure of the described process. A few more words about stakeholder participation. Stakeholder involvement is a technical activity per se. It's something that has been designed, has been implemented. There are several techniques, there are several emerging research on the way and the role in which public engagement could be included in a decision-making process. Traditionally, there are 5 levels of stakeholder involvements. The first and most important one, obviously, is the identification of stakeholders, which are not only the obvious ones, but also minorities and other stakeholders, which are sometimes or even typically underrepresented, under-identified. So the identification phase is very important. Then listening and managing the stakeholders in the process, the listening is very important, because some of the problems, some of the needs come out from this listening stage. There is information and communication. Stakeholders are informed about the process in the its implementation, different stages, and consultation. Stakeholders are asked for their opinion, their comments, their proposals, and the final and not yet very widespread level is that of participation. So stakeholders are directly involved in the decisions. So they are not just consulted, but they decide together with the public authority via referendum or other participative democracy exercises. Obviously, as everything in life, involving stakeholders as benefits and costs. We should even try to carry out a cost-benefit analysis of stakeholder engagement. The benefits are very clear. I mean, you improve the options and the final output of the process because you take into account more points of view. And in my experience, not projects that enter the stakeholder consultation phase exited equal to the initial proposal. Every time there is something that is changed, is improved, there is an impact on the final solution. Then there is a legitimation, of course, of the planning organization, because is recognized by those to represent those to whose decisions are intended to. There is a reduction of uncertainty. The uncertainty levels related to stakeholders and their reactions are obviously curtailed, so as the stability of the decisions. In my experience, some very strongly supported infrastructures survived successive governance cycles much better than infrastructures which were not, or projects which were not exposed to stakeholder involvement, were not felt as their own. And so this is a reduction of both level of context uncertainty as I defined in a previous slide. Risks obviously are there. Stakeholder engagement could be instrumental, and people understand that very easily. So instrumental use is a boomerang effect, but also there could be distortions in societal representation. So stakeholders do not represent society properly. Some are minorities, youngsters are typically less willing to be involved, and also vocal interests are the one which can be more able to express their opinions. So the stakeholders not necessarily represent the whole of society as intended by the governance exercise. So as I said, there are different techniques to manage and involve stakeholders at the different stages. One classical distinction is of stakeholder groups is related to the interest they have in the project, in the planning decisions, and the power they have. Of course, key stakeholders are the ones with high interest and high power. And they have to be consulted, and they should participate to the final decisions. Some other stakeholders are just to be informed, but the management of the process has the possibility to empower stakeholders. So some with high interest but low power could be empowered, could be given more visibility by the process management and be involved as key stakeholder. So this is by no means a trivial exercise. there is, as I said again, planning and professionality in doing that. And also research. For instance, recently, some research papers addressed the participatory value evaluation, in which the value of different objectives, different effects, different measures was obtained through internet and media, trying to empower again stakeholder group like young ones, which are not typically or easily involved by meetings, by conferences, and other traditional stakeholder management techniques. I want to give you two recently approved norms, rules in the Italian government related to infrastructures and public engagement in decisions making about infrastructures. They are both of the 2017. One is related to feasibility projects of infrastructures. Feasibility project is considered as the link between planning and technical design. In the feasibility project is the last stage of planning and is the first stage of design of a given infrastructure. So the first step of this feasibility project require that several alternatives are produced with ex-ante evaluation of their relative merits and problems. There is a cost-benefit analysis set of parameters there, but it strongly suggests to use a number of other elements, as much as these steps, these solutions, alternative solutions, have to go through public debate. So for large infrastructure above 100 million euros, there has to be a public debate. The next slide will say something more about that. After public debate, which is not deciding anything, it's just suggesting, as in the French case of the débat public. So the public debates produce a report, and after that, the proposing administration may change the project, may include some of the suggestions from the public debate into the project to go to the second step of this facility project, in which the selected option, the preferred options, the proposed options go through project development, which allows to define with greater precisions implementation costs, times, and techniques, something that is solid enough to be included in the programming of funds in the planning stages. And this is the second part of the of this approach, which is the public debate regulation. Again, projects with the cost larger than 100 million, like motorways, railway lines, ports, and so on, have to go through this public debate, which is as three phases, 3 steps with predefined maximum length, and the final conclusion is a report on the public debate, on the proponent, etc., etc. I don't want to go into details. Papers are there, but just want to stress the fact that in Italy, at least formally now, we have this double tool of public debate and feasibility project. We are strongly interconnected between them. Then very shortly, an application of this approach, or this cognitive model I proposed to the regional transportation plan of Veneto. Veneto is a region northern Italy, Venice, the capital. I think most of you know what we are talking about. This is one of the richest region of the country, but I don't want to go into the detail of the decisions that were taken during that process, but rather how the technical assessment, decision-making process, and stakeholders engagement interacted, and which were the lessons we learned from this interaction. First of all, the planning decisions. Was the first stage of the process I was proposing before. At the first stage, a number of options were decided. So long-term invariants, the things to do, and options, the things to design in successive stages. At this long-term and options were divided into policy and projects review. So there were some projects or some policies already proposed or in place, which was thought they had to be reviewed.
Il y avait des projets et des politiques déjà existants qui devaient être réexaminés parce qu'il s'agit de projets et de politiques suffisamment anciens pour ne plus être alignés sur les lois actuelles et la période pendant laquelle ces nouveaux projets ont été conçus.
Had to be carried out, were listed, and these had to be carried out, funded, and had to be carried out in subsequent stages of the decision-making project. So the plan included the funding of projects to be implemented and invariants, and projects to be developed, feasibility projects. Some of the lessons we learned in this exercise. First of all, these first two are two necessary conditions for the model I propose to you, the cognitive process approach. First of all, there has to be a very dedicated and committed public administration. And we are talking about the technical part of it. Obviously, there has to be a political endorsement, very strong political endorsement, but also a very committed and efficient technical or planning office, as we call it, which is in charge of the whole process. Second necessary condition, in my opinion, is that the community has to be one way or another used to be consulted or to express themselves about public choices. And in Veneto, this is very common because there has been a lot of debate, a lot of problems, a lot of contrasting views about the Venice Lagoon protection barriers, the big ships in the lagoon. So Veneto is a very, say, experienced region to participating and expressing their view and their opinions in public decision making. Third takeaway is the stakeholders engagement was very, very useful, both in managing uncertainty, because some new aspects were raised by stakeholders. For instance, local cities, local provinces presented problems that weren't perceived as such at the beginning. They also proposed solutions that were not perceived as such at the beginning. So the structured interaction with stakeholders was very beneficial to the final process. By structured interaction, I mean the fact that there is no just a conference, a meeting, but there are roundtables specific to individual problems, and there is a two-way interaction. Stakeholders have to produce written documents with proposal and criticism to the plan that has been developed, but they also replied. Some of them suggestions are accepted and they are told so. Some of them are rejected on the basis of other consideration, and they are told so the same. Fourth, the distinctions between invariants and options proved to be very useful because it diffused some potential conflicts. Some communities, some groups of interest proposed some specific projects. They wanted such and such road. They want such and such railway without having a project for that. The plan recognized that when it was the case that the need was legitimate, it included in this option in the feasibility project list, but did not decide to build that road or that rail or that rail station or whatever, because there were not enough information to decide that at that point in the planning process. And also, this invariant options and long and short-term framework allowed the region to be flexible with respect to very high uncertainty levels that were foreseen for the future, and observe that this plan was dated 2019, just on the verge before the it was concluded before the COVID-2 pandemic, but was approved in 2020. So in the middle of the region of the pandemic, COVID pandemic. So this uncertainty recognition was very timely, and it went for a very conservative approach in the evaluation of future needs. Just to make one instance, the freight traffic in northern Italy, in Veneto in particular, increased very significantly above the GDP growth over the last 10 years. This decoupling of traffic from economic growth is due to a number of reasons, including the fact that Italian industry exports has increased way more than GDP. So economy has changed during these last 10 years. If this change is going to stay up, congestion problems will be everywhere. But we did not assume that as a trend, as a sure trend for the next decades, because it was very much related to one phase of the economy, which not necessarily would go on in the next 20 years as it went in the last 10. So we decide to minimize the risk of optimistic bias by assuming a very different growth rate or no growth rate at all, just to minimize the risk of future investment, infrastructure investment in a land which is very delicate. The equilibrium between nature and built environment is very at risk in Veneto. So beyond already building infrastructure, already in the building phase, or completely financed and next to start with the building, new infrastructure decisions were postponed until it was clear which was the way in which the regional and national economy will go on in the next few years, that by chance are now the post-COVID, we hope post-COVID recovery phase. So conclusions and recommendations. Quantitative methods in this context, in respect to the points I made in this presentation, have new roles in addition to the traditional ones. The traditional ones are still very much there, but there are new requirements for those methods. Traditional roles as that to support the analysis of the current system, to design possible future or action scenarios and the simulation of their impacts and the comparison of possible scenarios, action scenarios. By comparison, I mean all the techniques that we have been discussing these days, from cost-benefit analysis, multi-criteria, or other techniques. And these are the new requirements that that raise from my experience and from the participative planning processes I participated in. First of all, the models should be able to address the impacts which are relevant to the stakeholders, not only to decision makers. Economic impacts and so on and so forth are relevant to decision makers, to some stakeholders, but to others, the noise level is important. To others, I mean, the PM, the small particle pollution is relevant. The accessibility to school is relevant. So these impacts should be addressed by the models, should be identified first and modeled later. The second indication is that it's very, very important that modeling results analysis should be made as clear as possible for non-expert. This is not a trivial activity, because we don't want to lose the depth and the breadth of analytical tools, but we have to be able to make it understandable. New graphics is very important. New graphics representation, new analogies, examples have to be devised to make things understandable to those who are not expert in the sector. Quantitative and qualitative impacts should be assessed for different actors. We discussed a lot about equity these days. Equity could be, I mean, people do not understand the Gini index, right? But they understand a map in which different zones, for instance, have different accessibility levels to school, to hospital, to workplaces. And the changes in the accessibility corresponding to different plans, different actions, could be shown to the different stakeholders groups involved in the process, as well as vertical equity measures like youngsters, like elderly people, disabled people, and so on. The ex post analysis is very important, as I said, in the process, but also from other processes. They can be built as case studies. I show you, for instance, some decades ago, I worked with the city of Naples for deciding whether a surface tram line should be built or an underground metro line should be built instead. In some cases, we decide for the underground because the traffic level was high enough. In other cases, the surface line. And there were oppositions to the traffic, to the rail line, because it was felt that it could be dangerous for pedestrians, for cyclists, etc. And it was very beneficial then. It was not like now, today you go on internet and look by yourself, but still it was very beneficial then to show that such lines were operating in different cities in the world and were operating without safety problems. The same is true for some limited access area in the center, some pedestrian area in the center, where shoppers typically oppose this idea at the beginning, and showing them that a number of other projects were successful and the level of shopping increased in this area rather than decreased that they feared, were very, very useful to diffuse this opposition. And then I want to spend a few words about uncertainty. Uncertainty requires new assessment tools, especially high level of uncertainty, level 3 and level 4, may require, do require different decision tools and comparison tools like minimal regret, scenario discovery. And these tools require explicitly the attitude towards the risk aversion or the risk taking attitude of the decision makers, and it has to be made explicit. You want to min max the risk, you don't max min the risk. There are different approaches and different results. They may be different results. So not only the level of uncertainty, but the attitude towards uncertainty is something that's to be explicitly recognized in the assessment phase. And last word about nudging. Nudging policies are very increasingly important. And from the demand modeling point of view, just to make things more concrete, we are not still able to anticipate the effects of these policies. Some indications at the end. I was too long, I know, and I go very quickly through that. In my opinion, transportation planning should be defined explicitly as a decision-making process. However you want to manage it, whatever the decision project, the management model is a decision-making. Public engagement in planning and design should be included explicitly, as in Italy recently, as has been the case in France since a few decades. But I'm not aware of more other countries in which is mandatory and is also regulated in detail. The feasibility projects, in my experience, is a very important design phase that should be formalized and explicitly included in the norms. In Italy, just to refer to what I know better, before the feasibility project, the administration could not financing the design of an infrastructure if that infrastructure was not already decided to be built. So you decided to build something without having the vaguest idea of the costs, on the difficulties, of the consensus of anything. Finally, enlarge the scope of plans and projects to include qualitative variables. As this qualitative, I mean that they can be quantified, such as equity, or they cannot be quantified as consensus. But if a project, and I go back to one of my first slides, if the project proposed to the level 2 planning has been the result of the good planning process or a bad